One of the most primitive yet effective forms of weaponry in history is a wooden stick sharpened at one or both ends. If you extend the length of such a stick and add a metal or stone tip, you create a spear, a tool capable of effectively countering most types of adversaries armed with cold weapons. But what happens when you further extend the spear, say, twice its length? Although this concept dates back centuries, it appears to have been somewhat overlooked on the European battlefield. Instead, European warfare favored shorter pole arms in combination with shields. For the first time, a tactic resembling what we'll discuss later emerged on the medieval battlefield during the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. In this battle, proud Scots were pitted against a numerically superior English army consisting primarily of infantry. The Scottish forces were divided into 4 concentric circles, using stakes and sharpened logs to form a protective barrier. The soldiers in the outer ranks knelt, positioning their 12-foot pikes towards the enemy, while the subsequent rows placed their pikes above the heads of those in front. To put it in perspective, 12 feet equals 3.6 meters, twice the length of a standard infantry spear and comparable to a knight's lance. Deployed in this hedgehog-like formation known as the schiltron, these formations were exceedingly immobile, essentially serving as defensive strongholds. While this early form of medieval pikemen proved invulnerable to English knights, it was vulnerable to archers and slingers, despite the protection provided by Scottish marksmen. 15 years later, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots once again formed their schiltrons. This time, luck smiled upon them as they successfully repelled the attacks of English knights. This defeat proved to be one of the most significant setbacks for the English throughout the entire Middle Ages. Similar formations would be adopted later by the Flemish and the Portuguese, but it was the Swiss mercenaries who truly refined this tactical approach. They transformed their pikemen into an exceptionally powerful offensive force. The ascent of the Swiss to the pinnacle of glory began in the 14th century when their predominantly infantry forces achieved victories over the traditional cavalry forces of the late Middle Ages. Armed primarily with pole arms, they stood out as the only infantry capable of independently forging success on the battlefield. For the most part, Swiss warriors were a response from a relatively impoverished and remote region to the might of their bellicose neighbors. Immersed in a culture of year-round martial competitions, their militias boasted an impressive level of skill when it came to real battles. Their unwavering square formations retained their cohesion and could effectively operate in almost any environment. They demonstrated their prowess by embarking on arduous marches through wooded hills, often catching their adversaries off guard, as seen in the Battle of Nancy in 1477. So how did the Swiss mercenaries operate? Holding on to the idea that the long pike decidedly outperformed any other cold weapon in formation battles, their military foundation was indeed the pikemen. While they had their own crossbows, arquebuses, and cannons, ranged weaponry took a back seat. This proved to be a double-edged sword, as in the end the densely packed ranks of pikemen were highly vulnerable to long-range units. After 1500, Spanish arquebusiers demonstrated the superiority of the new weaponry over the classics. What's more, shortly thereafter, the Spaniards became renowned for their innovative infantry tactic, commonly known as pike and shot. In essence, they retained pikemen as the core, following the Swiss example, but added musketeers and arquebusiers to create a mutually beneficial formation. The musketeers unleashed their fire and sought cover behind the pikes to shield themselves from enemy cavalry attacks. The front ranks of pikemen also wore infantry armor. As most of Europe transitioned to firearms, the Iberian Peninsula took great care to equip its new armies, perhaps too well. For the following century, the Spanish tercio was considered nearly invincible. Emerging from the crucible of the Italian Wars, the tercio was officially recognized in 1536. Typical tercio soldiers wielded long, 5-meter pikes, partial steel plate armor, arquebuses, heavier muskets, swords, and round shields called rotellas. The rotellas were carried by casualists, infantrymen resembling Roman legionaries, and they played a crucial role in safeguarding the pike formations during clashes. What about cavalry? The role of heavy cavalry changed dramatically with the advent of regular armies and new tactics that virtually reduced classical armored cavalry to irrelevance. Cavalry charges became ineffective against long pikes, and foot soldiers armed with muskets posed significant threats at distances of 50-100 meters. Throughout the 16th century, the role of heavy cavalry shifted from being the dominant force to serving as auxiliary raiders who could breach enemy lines only under specific conditions. With the decline of feudalism, the era of the knights as we know them came to an end. The remaining horsemen were integrated into new professional armies and lost their distinctive identity. While they often held officer positions, they understood that the chivalric code and lances had become almost irrelevant in the new realities of warfare. The old horsemen were replaced by a new generation of riders, equally noble in origin but now bound by a different set of rules. Above all, long lances gave way to cavalry pistols. A bullet could reach any pikeman, regardless of the length of his pike. The earliest records of Reitars, German horsemen armed with pistols, date back to the Schmalkaldic War of 1547. After this conflict, defenders were allowed to leave their weapons, including pistols with wheel locks. These early Reitars typically carried a sword, a pistol, and a hunting spear for boars. However, by the early 17th century, their weaponry had evolved to include only arquebuses, pistols, and swords. Everything changed after the Battle of Rocroi in 1643 and the military reforms of Gustavus Adolphus. But that's a different story. If you were a cavalry commander in history, which style of cavalry would you choose to lead into battle and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to like and subscribe.